Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible episode. I don't know if it's going to be a super incredible episode, but it is going to be an incredible episode today. And we don't have a large theme like we did last week where I talked about the plumber option today. Going through a couple different topics that we're going to have today. First up, I'm going to begin with a bunch of things that are going on in the political world and the domestic political world. And then there's a theme I want to have about crime and what people are attributing to the rise in crime and just things that media coverage of this. And that will be it. And I'm also going to incorporate the cognitive elite question into the first half of the show today. So not going to be waiting for the end till for the cognitive elite special. I know some people may want to wait till the end, but it's going to be mixed into the show today. So the first thing I want to talk about is, and when I'm talking about the political field, I'm really talking about what is going on with Republicans. And there was a bunch of events last week that illustrate, interesting things going on with the Republican Party. The first thing, I want to backtrack a little bit and say, it looks as if Trump is going to run in 2024, but people still want to dip their toes in and show their brand and how they're a major figure in the party, just in case Trump doesn't run. But Trump, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer every day that Trump is definitely going to run, barring a health incident or something of that sort. Trump is definitely going to run in 2024. It looks like his legal problems are not going to really hinder him that much. I mean, they're trying to do this both with some financial stuff in New York and with the January 6th committee. Not really working to bring him down. And, at least 50% of Republicans want Trump again as their nominee. So, and that's not going to change. That number is only going to increase when he actually announces he wants to run. But there are candidates who are wanting to show that they may challenge him, or that if he doesn't run, I want to rephrase that. They may still throw their hat in the ring if he doesn't run, or they might even challenge him. And one of those people is Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott, Texas governor. You guys all may know him as the handicapped governor. He's always been a big name in politics since he became governor in 2018. No, it was actually a longer time ago. It was 2014. I almost said 2018. That was his second term where he got elected. He got elected in 2014. And he's been there. He's running again for his third term this year. It's likely going to win. But he's, set on the notion that illegal immigration is a way to build his brand, his name, this year, maybe ahead of the 2022 election, maybe he's looking to 2024. But he hit on an interesting way to get the attention of Washington, D.C. to the problem at the border. I'm sure all of you guys know, if you've been paying attention to the border crisis, it's getting worse. Actually, the numbers in these few months alone in 2021 or 2022, they're still well over 100,000, nearly 200,000 every month. And just in March, it was over 220,000 illegal migrants that were detained. Now, you got to remember, these are just the migrants that they caught. There are tens of thousands of migrants that they didn't catch who are coming through the border. And so this number is only the ones that they caught. And that was a record-setting number for whole of Biden administration. And last year, there were at least, I believe it was roughly 2 million in 2021 illegal detentions. And this year, it's going to be even more because they're now getting rid of Title 42. Title 42, if you guys aren't familiar with that, was a policy designed to prevent the spread of COVID, which allowed officials to expedite deportations of illegals. And Biden was only using this against adult migrants, adult male migrants. So if they didn't bring a kid along or any minor, they got deported immediately. Or not necessarily immediately, but deported much more quickly than they would have without Title 42. Well, they're getting rid of Title 42 because the left has been demanding it, and the same people demanding this measure to get eliminated are those who've been double masked, not leaving their homes for the past 2 years, and still believe COVID is a major menace, but they don't believe COVID is a major menace when it comes to migrants. Migrants are just somehow immune to COVID. So they're getting rid of that, and a lot of these Republican governors who are on border states or near border states or just taking a lot of migrants are worried that they're now going to have a huge flood coming across. And they've already been having a major flood since Biden, but it's only going to get worse. They estimate that 18,000 migrants per day, and these are just the ones that they're going to detain. I believe that these are just the number of ones who are going to be detained, are going to be coming across the border every day without Title 42. And, I guess you can only laugh about it. I mean, it's just so insane that this would be our policy. And it's supposed to end in May. And so even just the figures from probably, May to December might outstrip the number of migrants who were detained last year. So we're just going to have a veritable, camp of the saints coming across our border this year. And the federal government is like, oh, well, the Biden administration doesn't give a shit about this, and they don't care about this. Even though in his State of the Union address, Biden was saying how, we're going to have security at the border. We're getting tough. We're making it more secure. And clearly, they're not doing anything. And anything that they even want to attempt, like that they're forced to attempt, they don't want to even do. They had this policy, this Trump-era policy, remain in Mexico, which forced people who come to the border and be like, I'm seeking asylum. It's really dangerous in El Salvador. I need asylum. And then they're like, okay, but you have to remain in Mexico. You have to wait outside of America while we process your asylum application. And Biden got rid of that, which allowed these people to come in, which now, if they now just have to say, I'm applying for asylum, they're allowed into America and they're basically stuck here forever unless they deport them. And as the administration says, they're not going to deport illegals unless they commit a serious crime, a very serious crime. So basically, the only way an illegal can get deported under the Biden administration, if they're already in the country, is if they murder somebody. And they have to wait till after their prison sentence to be deported. And so that's now the standard that they operate under, which is all very, very crazy. And so, but the Biden administration doesn't even want to enforce that rule. They eliminated it last year. A court told them, no, you have to keep doing this. And they're really not processing many people under that. They're still letting in these asylum seekers into our country while their asylum application is processed. So this is just complete insanity with immigration and the border. And so, as I keep mentioning, a lot of these Republican governors are wanting to do something about it because, they just can't sit there and complain and just hope that that's enough to sway voters or show that they're doing something. So this is not Greg Abbott's policy alone. Is that Ron DeSantis has also talked about this, is that Greg Abbott is taking these migrants from Texas. They're being dropped off. Federal authorities are dropping off illegals all over the place. Some of them, they just take them to a nearby Texas town, drop off hundreds, and like, here you go, Texas town, good luck. Or they get free flights for them and fly them throughout the country. They've flown them to Florida. They've thrown them to Tennessee, I believe in some of the Great Plains states. And so they're being flown everywhere thanks to taxpayers. And so Abbott has been, these towns obviously are really upset about, they're pretty small. They don't have facilities to house like 100 or so migrants that have been dumped on them. And like, can you get rid of them? Can you do something? And it's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bus them to DC and to send a message to the libtards about this. Now, I understand the one point is that they have an immediate pressing problem in the state where it's these local towns, like they don't know what the hell to do with these migrants. They want them out of town and they need help to do that. And Texas is like, okay, sure, we'll take them somewhere else. But in terms of this actually sending a message to libtards, it's not actually doing it the message they want. Even though they're saying that now the federal authorities are no longer dropping them off in the state, really what Texas is doing with state taxpayer money, with the state's own income, the state's own money, is that they're taking these migrants and doing the federal job for them. I mean, the feds want these illegals dispersed everywhere. And also, these blue states, maybe not DC necessarily, but I mean, a lot of these blue states, they want illegal migrants. There's a reason why they're passing sanctuary city legislation in all these places, and they don't want to deport them. They want those illegals to come to their area. So really, what Texas is doing is they're doing the federal liberal bureaucrats' job for them. And Jen Psaki in her press conference was like snarkily thanking Greg Abbott for sending these migrants. So like, oh, thank you for doing what we want to do, is we want to send these illegals everywhere throughout the country. Now Texas is doing it for us. Thank you, Texas. And so it's not really sending quite the message. I think it's one thing is that conservatives love these PR stunts. They're like, wow, we're really going to stick it to libtards by doing what they want. And no, it's actually, you're doing exactly what they want with your own money. It reminds me of the time that Matt Walsh raised a ton of money for AOC's abuela, who had like a house flooded or something in Puerto Rico, or there's something wrong with her house. And they're like, wow, conservatives are going to raise a ton of money to own the liberals with this. And we're just going to show how awesome we are. And really, it just raised a bunch of money for their enemies. And now with this situation is you are taking these people that liberals already worship and they want to be by, and you're using your own money to bring them closer to where they are, and now you're dispersing them throughout the country. That it might be even harder to deport them now, because it's rather than being in a rural Texas town where there's not much place to go, everyone knows where they are when they can go and deport them. They now could be dispersed throughout the country. And also, when these migrants were dropped there, Catholic Charities took up the slack to make sure that they had housing and fare to wherever they wanted to go in the country. Maybe they didn't have access to those resources in a rural Texas town. So, I understand what the problems within rural Texas town, and that they want them out of there, and the state is doing them a favor. But when it comes to the rest of America as a whole, this is actually a negative thing. And Texas is claiming that they're no longer dumping these migrants in Texas. Okay, that's a win for your small towns, but that's not necessarily a win for America, because now that just means the feds are going to spend more money to make sure that they're dispersed further into the interior of the homeland so that they can go wherever they want. And it is just a PR stunt. And some people keep claiming this, like Ron DeSantis is promising that he has tons of money to do this as well, to send them to he hasn't said DC. He's instead saying like Delaware and Martha's Vineyard for some reason, and some other sanctuary states. And he's like, we're going to send all these migrants in Florida to other places in America, which these migrants aren't getting deported. They're not leaving America. They're just going to a place where it's even less likely for them to get deported, and it's more likely that they stay here permanently. But in some ways that the governors are doing this because they don't have many options into enforcing law, because states are handcuffed in what they can do with federal immigration law. It's the federal government's job to enforce immigration law, and the feds aren't doing it. And there was a famous fight in 2010. Some of my listeners might not remember this because they were too young. But in 2010, Arizona passed a strong immigration enforcement bill that was going to. They said it was going to lead to racial profiling, because it authorized any law enforcement officer to basically ask for documentation and papers of these illegals, and to have a greater degree of cooperation with ICE and others. It essentially made local and state law enforcement act more like ICE. I mean, they weren't going to necessarily do the deportation, but they were going to aggressively go after illegal immigrants. And there was a large fight over this, and the Supreme Court upheld some of the measures, but said that others were unconstitutional and whatever. And it was like the last time, and some states began passing similar measures due to the hoopla around it. And, it was a way of dealing with illegal immigration, but, it's obviously we still have that problem. And now it's worse than even in 2010. But that idea was actually about enforcing law and making life more difficult for illegals. The busing is making life easier for them at the state's expense rather than the federal government's expense, and it's not making the federal government actually enforce the laws. Which there are things that, Texas and a few other states are doing things to make it tougher on illegals. The one thing I learned is that some of these states have been sending, state and national guard to out and enforce the border. Some ways it's just been a PR stunt because they're not allowed to actually arrest these guys if they catch them crossing the border. I mean, they can call up Border Patrol to do that. I mean, that's how ridiculous it is. But they are finding ways that they've maybe committed a crime. They say oh, well, you're trespassing, I'm going to arrest you. And they have arrested a few people, and a couple of other states have done this. I think Arizona, they've also had it, maybe not to the same extent as Texas, but there are things that they can do to make life more difficult for illegals, barring them from able to use government services, other things. I mean, yeah, a lot of these are going to be challenged in court. A lot of these things, maybe the courts are going to overturn, but you really have to just, the goal should be making life difficult for illegals to stay in your state rather than making it easier, and also putting pressure on the federal government to actually enforce the law. But some ways, maybe the state governments are going to have to come in and actually enforce the law when the federal government is being found in dereliction of their duty. That's something to keep in mind. But it is interesting that now all these Republicans are switching to a focus on immigration. Immigration, we haven't, much talked about. At least not that much on the program, even though it's been a major issue. And the news media hasn't been that focused in on it as well. But it's going to be a huge, huge issue coming this summer, because you have to remember is that usually in the summer months is when there's a mass explosion at the border, and we're already having our highest numbers in March, which is a fairly chilly March. Maybe not necessarily maybe in northern Mexico and Texas, but everywhere else, it's not necessarily been. It's not usually the month you would expect the numbers to really skyrocket, but you're really going to see the numbers get even higher. And this is pre-Title 42 being used, and most of the migrants that they had detained in the last month who came through, were deported under Title 42. Now those ones are going to be staying in the country for a while. So at least over 100,000. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the numbers are not only going to increase, is that the numbers of deported are going to massively decrease. So you're going to see probably the numbers get up to 250,000, maybe even 300,000, and pretty much the majority of those people are not going to be deported in a timely manner. They're going to stay here, and it's going to just plunge our system into chaos. And so this is going to be probably a bigger issue than Ukraine in the 2022 election. A lot of people have been worried about it's a return to neoconism and hawkery, foreign policy hawkery with Ukraine. That is true, but I don't think it's not going to matter on the campaign trail. People are just going to be saying, I stand with Ukraine, and that's basically going to be it. And a candidate, maybe somebody like J.D. Vance or somebody else who is more skeptical of the whole affair, it's probably not going to hurt them, because everything's going to be situated on immigration, and immigration is going to be a really weak issue for Democrats, especially when you have 300,000 migrants pouring across the border every month, and pretty much none of them being deported. And so lots of that. I don't know if that's a white pill, but it's there. The one thing that I think Republicans need to focus on with this issue, and this should become an issue because we're going to see pregnant mothers trying to get in, is that they really need to be a renewed focus on eliminating birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship is such a important feature to the illegal immigration debate. I don't think it just like in the immigration debate in general, because birthright citizenship allows immigrants, whether they're legal or illegal, to stay here. it gives them, as they've always called them back in the day when there was last being debated in 2010 to a significant extent. It was sort of debated during 2016 when Trump got in. But they called them anchor babies because they're able to drop anchor through their kids, because these kids are now considered citizens. And and especially among liberal bureaucrats, they don't want to deport anyone, even if they're convicted of a crime. They especially don't want to deport mothers of citizens. So these people are able to drop anchor through these kids. This would be, if eliminating birthright citizenship would make us have a far more sensible immigration policy. We'd probably even have to worry less about, low-skilled guest workers coming here, because they would not be able to stay here permanently if without birthright citizenship. If they managed to have a kid here, they would not be tied to this country. That child would not be considered an American citizen. They would not be able to use their child to gain a foothold in our country. And they would just simply work here for a few years and go back. And there would not be that big of an issue to have them here. One of the biggest problems with guest workers and of course illegal immigrants, is that they're able to gain a permanent foothold here and never leave through their children. And if we eliminated birthright citizenship, where we don't consider their kids American citizens, that creates a whole new platform where these immigrants are going to be less inclined to stay here, and it's going to be easier to push them back to their native country rather than taking care of them for the rest of their life. And so Republicans don't really talk about birthright citizenship enough. Some of it is just Republicans just react to whatever they see in the news. So they see people coming across the border, so their whole focus is just on the border. There's not even much focus on deportation, not even much of a focus on legal immigration, and stuff about like birthright citizenship gets lost in the mix. But birthright citizenship connects to both legal and illegal, and connects to the border crisis. If we eliminated birthright citizenship, there would be far fewer illegals I wouldn't necessarily say far fewer, but there would be fewer illegals coming here. They would know that they have less of an opportunity to stay here through their children if they have a kid here. And, it'd just make our country a lot better without birthright citizenship. And it's, we're one of the few countries that have such a generous liberal citizenship offer. And it's like, how can you claim yourself to be a citizen when you literally were just born here? You don't know the language, don't know the culture or heritage. You have no connections to here besides you were just born here by parents who can't speak the language and don't see themselves as American. And there's a problem with birth tourism too, where people come here from other countries. They fly, pregnant mothers fly here, they have their kid here, their kid's now an American citizen, and it gives them a ton of benefits. A lot of Chinese mothers are big into this, and so is elsewhere. And it negates the importance of citizenship. What does citizenship mean? It's just like it's nothing. It's nothing of the sort. I mean, it would be like a concealed carry license matters more than citizenship. Citizenship is a worthless piece of paper if we just hand it out to everyone. And so you have to make citizenship mean something. And birthright citizenship makes it mean literally nothing, besides just a benefit that anyone can obtain, but it requires no loyalty or no knowledge or no real connection to the state of America. And certainly no connection to the American people. So it's just something that Republicans need to focus more on, and hopefully they do, because birthright citizenship is connected deeply to illegal immigration, and we would solve a lot of our issues, especially with the guest workers. And I think even guest workers would be less of a problem if we simply knew that they would just come here for a few years, they pick the fruit or whatever, and then they go back, and they would not be able to obtain citizenship and not gain a permanent foothold here. And we can only do this by eliminating birthright citizenship. So that's just something I want to speak on the issue. Moving gears a little bit, I mentioned this person earlier, and you guys all know, if you're highly respected, highly devoted listeners, you know I love talking about this person. That is none other than Ron DeSantis. And for what he's doing on immigration is pretty good. There's a new bill in Florida that it aims to punish companies that work with the transportation of these illegal immigrants throughout the country, whether they're like bus companies or airlines, whatever, it's wanting to ensure that the state government doesn't work with them anymore, and also making it harder on illegal immigrants and harder on sanctuary cities to exist in Florida. So it's a pretty good bill otherwise. But DeSantis supporters are continuing to imagine DeSantis doing things and imagining that he's the only one doing them. So Florida is about to have its own redistricting, and it's going to overwhelmingly favor Republicans. I think it's going to be 22 relatively Republican-leaning districts and 8 Democrat-leaning districts. Pretty good proportion if you're wanting to keep the state red. Now, for years, Republicans have engaged in the practice that Democrats call gerrymandering. Everyone gerrymanders. The difference is that gerrymandering in Democrat states is considered fairness, and gerrymandering in Republican states is considered anti-democratic. And you can see this is that nobody's really challenging the insane gerrymandering that occurs in Maryland, in Illinois, in New Jersey, all these places. Maryland is one of the worst states with gerrymandering. They basically ensure that none of the red parts of the state can have their own congressman. I think they're down to just one district, I believe, that has a Republican congressman. Maryland's a pretty blue state, but just being a state with one Republican congressman, there's been a fair amount of gerrymandering. So everybody does this, and Republicans have been doing this for years, and liberals have been complaining about it for years. But for some reason, conservative pundits who are just enthralled with Ron DeSantis think that Ron DeSantis was the first person to use state power to ensure that Republicans get more districts in a currently Republican-dominated state or a currently Republican-led state, and that this has never happened before, is that Republicans have just been fearful of power. It's like, oh my God, no, state power, no, we can't use it. We can't use it. We have to just shoo it away. We have to have fairness. We have to ensure that there's an equal amount of Republican to Democrat districts, and we're just so terrified of power. There's an idea among a lot of conservatives, particularly among populist types, that that they treat power like the Ring of Power from Lord of the Rings. But instead of in Lord of the Rings where it's going to corrupt you, it's actually Boromir and Denethor in Lord of the Rings are right. And Boromir is why don't we use the ring for good? And then Populus is yeah, that's the correct mean. Meanwhile, everyone else that has apparently been running Republican circles for years are just no, we can't use the ring. It will be destroyed in the process. But Populus is not, and I'm not saying that the Ring of Power will destroy them in the process or anything like that. I'm simply saying is that Republicans have used state power to an extent, and especially when it comes to redistricting and ensuring that their own party gets a greater slice of delegations and congressional seats. They've done this for many, many years. And for some reason, they just think that these ideas have plopped to their head. And they always act like DeSantis is counteracting some libertarian straw man that's dominated a Republican discourse. That, prior to, most of the people who make this argument don't ever want to give any credit to Trump because they hate Trump. But up until 2016, but not due to Trump, is that Republicans in the past would just give all their power to Democrats and would never use political power, which they're forgetting what neocons did in the Bush administration. I mean, the neocons got us into war through a lot of their shenanigans with power, and also allowed for torture and numerous other things. They weren't using power for good means, but they were using power. And maybe it's not necessarily what we wanted people to use power for, but they were willing to use power. And they certainly used the power of conservative movement to purge critics. So these are not people who operate on some straw man standard of fairness. They've always operated on the idea that they need to gain power. It's just that a lot of populist types are coming from demanding power from a position of weakness where they're not close to that power, and they're just kind of yelling at Republican lawmakers or whatever to use power, which, I mean, in some ways you do need to be yelling at them to do this, but they're just imagining that with a stroke of a pen, they can turn America into a based theocratic monarchy under King Ron the First, and it would be just that easy. But Republicans are just too afraid to do this, and it really just doesn't understand how the American system works. It doesn't understand the different levers of power that are going on and institutional powers that are there that prevent you from instituting base theocratic monarchy under Ron DeSantis. It would be there. And so it's like all these people just like talking about arresting enemies or even executing people who are like groomers and stuff. And it's like, and they're treating this as like serious proposals. And like, I don't, this is like just fantasy land that you're operating under. But they definitely do this with DeSantis, and imagining that DeSantis is the first one to figure out that you should use state power to do things. This originated a lot with the dissident right and the alt-right back in 2015 and 2016. And really what we were using this argument for is primarily because Republicans were not willing to use state power to counteract like big tech censorship, which is still a thing we need to do, even though there's still a cool thing going on with Elon Musk. Maybe Elon Musk buying up Twitter may solve a lot of the Twitter censorship issues. I mean, we are placing our faith in a billionaire, a mercurial billionaire, to solve free speech, which I don't know about how much I trust that. But with those issues, like there should be some intervention in the economy and the state of affairs. But it's gotten to this point where they now imagine that Republicans have always operated as libertarians and always are like, oh, yes, you can, of course, strike me on the other cheek because I play by the rules of fairness and I've never decided to use power before. And this is a lot of the ways that they use with DeSantis. And their terrible nickname for him is like Heavy D. It's such a bad nickname. Heavy D. It's like, what is that? Like, I mean, I guess it's better than Big D because Big D is implying, he's got a, he's got a big package, so to speak. And but Heavy D still implies that too. It's like, Heavy D? It's like, it's really heavy down there? What the hell is that? Like, I don't want to have this image in my mind. And it's like, why are they calling him Heavy D? Like, Heavy D is so, like, is he like heavy metal? No, he's not like heavy metal. And it's like Heavy D. And anything that's like, begins with like adjective D, people are automatically going to think of dick. It's like just how it works in English. I always said English society, but American society. It's just how it is. And like Heavy D is just like a weird thing to imagine. And I don't think it's really going to catch on, but it is like this type of astroturf phenomenon with DeSantis. Like DeSantis is doing a lot of good things. Like I like him as a governor. But imagining him as this like charismatic Messiah who's going to lead us to the promised land is just completely out of touch with what DeSantis exists in reality. Is that they imagine that there is this mythical DeSantis who is willing to destroy every corporation, who's willing to personally deport every illegal immigrant, who's willing to, destroy big tech, he's going to cancel capitalism too, and he's going to institute like a theocracy when it gets to power. And it's like, DeSantis is just like a pretty smart Republican politician who lacks a lot of charisma. I always mention this, he doesn't have charisma. And a lot of people always want to discount the importance of the charisma to a leader. And it's like, no, imagine if like Benito Mussolini was like a terrible public speaker. He would have gotten nowhere, if like this. And people just imagine like, oh, well, they just voted for Benito Mussolini because he had really smart policies. It's like, all these people gathered around in Rome and they're hearing Ron DeSantis read from a wonky policy sheet. And all these Italians are just scanning and getting really inspired by his latest policy proposal. And that's not how things work. That's not how you work it's like even the same way with a salesman. Like imagine going to a salesman and he's really boring and he's just like you're just like wanting to fall asleep to him. He may be proposing like a great reason why you should buy a car or buy this house or whatever he's trying to sell you. But if he's just like being there like, the warranty is really good. And this, if you look at the policy sheet, it's just going over the policy reasons, and he's not trying to like connect with you and build that connection and show that he's like a charming individual, that he's like somebody that you like and you can relate to. You're less likely to buy from him, no matter how well like his presentation is and like the bullet points are. If he's delivering it poorly, it's not going to work. And it's the same with politicians. And for whatever reason, a lot of Republicans become averse to this idea of charisma. They just don't want to believe that charisma is important. It's like, I just focus on policies. It's like you go and do like 8 hours of research on your own, and you're just like, I am so inspired by these policy proposals, I'm going to vote for them. No, it's usually just like you're watching a speech and you're like, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. He really motivates me. He really animates me. I find him really funny. I don't find him funny. People care more about personality than they do policy. Trump proves this. Obama definitely proves this. I mean, this goes through. It's like people just don't sit there reading like a tome about policy from this candidate and then decide that they're going to support him. Now, policies can impact like whether they're going to support his candidate, and not every Republican is very charismatic. I think when you're running for Congress or Senate or governor, a lot of it can come down to policy. And even when president, it's still what policies they support are important. But the personality factor is also very important, and how they present themselves, what they represent to you, how they're selling their message is critical. And for whatever reason, people just discount that with DeSantis and his wooden lines read from a note card and his obvious imitation of Trump. People just think that this is really just gonna like electrify people. And I mean, people like DeSantis, but they prefer Trump over DeSantis. And, you know, DeSantis just does not have that power. He does not have that magic that Trump has. You know, there are candidates with even more charisma. I would even say, even though he's confined to a wheelchair, I generally find Greg Abbott has more charisma than DeSantis. And Abbott really presents this like nice, down home, evangelical Christian vibe. And he's being in the wheelchair further emphasizes this as like his humility. And I think that's like really connects with more people than like DeSantis being like a store brand Trump. And I mean, like DeSantis is good, but I always I'm countering the mythical DeSantis that is proposed on right-wing Twitter, where he's like the only one taking down corporations. And even when it comes to his like fight with Disney, is that DeSantis and the Florida state legislature, even though they're making a big fuss about Disney, you know, they gave like Disney a bunch of tax subsidies just last year that like brought like thousands of workers to Florida. And also all these conservatives complain about Californians moving everywhere. And they're like, they treat Californians like they're like some harmful ethnic group. Like they're orcs or something coming through. I mean, we're keeping up the Lord of the Rings references here, but they're orcs coming through, and they're like, and if you're any connection to California, you're once a Californian, always a Californian. And it creates all these characteristics and traits with you. And I don't really believe that. I think a lot of the Californians who are leaving now are pretty conservative. I've met some very conservative, very right-wing Californians who just left. And, you know, they finally realized, like, after COVID, they're like, I'm done with the state. You know, it's over. I'm leaving. But they think people like the Californians are just like to destroy their state. And it's like, I think you're worrying about the wrong group coming into your state. It's like Californians. It's just a way of just like getting into ethnic and racial animosity in a politically correct way. But it's ultimately very stupid. I mean, like, these Californians are probably very little different from the Texans or Floridians. It's like, down here in Orlando, we don't do those stuff like that. It's like, what the hell do you imagine Orlando's like, or Houston? Like, Californians might be better than some of the locals. I mean, there's shitlibs there too as well. And so, but even though like all of DeSantis supporters are like very anti-California, even though many of them are Californians themselves and want like Californians like segregated and stripped of their political rights if they move to another state, and one example, actually, to continue on this is like really funny, is that there was like some Indian who I believe had moved to Florida, or he had moved to a red state, and he had this long Twitter thread about how he's like, upset with with his current state. And people looked at this thread and it's like, you know what this means? We can't have Californians here. It's like, I think you guys are missing a bigger trait of this person. besides what state he had come from, but they don't want to acknowledge that. And so I don't. There is some problem with these people moving there, but you know who's contributing to these problems? DeSantis. They're giving tax breaks to these companies to bring over their workers there, and now these workers are the ones who are demanding that Disney oppose and punish Florida for their the alleged "Don't Say Gay" bill. And so DeSantis isn't really punishing them. He's giving rewards to his enemies, but he's going on TV saying that they're going to really hurt Disney, but in fact, they're have pushed through tax subsidies for this company that they didn't just suddenly become woke in March of 2022. Like, Disney's been woke and very left wing for a long time, and yet they still gave them tax breaks just last year. So and I think they signed it into law earlier in early 2022. So that's just something to keep in mind, that DeSantis plays up what they populism wants him to be, but he doesn't exactly exist in reality. Now for the cognitive elite question. Two reminders. First off, this is not the end of the podcast. There's going to be more topics after this, but I want to bring the cognitive elite question up a little bit earlier. But the second reminder is you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highly-respected.substack.com, and make sure you sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there if you haven't already. I know all the true blue diehard highly respected fans have already signed up for the IQ supplements, but there's a few people out there who just don't want the additional IQ boost for some reason. I don't know why, but they're out there. But I want to go to the question. This one comes from Friendly Groiper. We gotta love Friendly Groiper. We gotta love that name. He asks, Scott, should we vote for candidates who are generally much closer to us on the issues than the people they're running against, but have either disavowed us or probably would if asked? I'm thinking about people like Joe Kent and J.D. Vance. Joe Kent and J.D. Vance are two different. This is two different subjects because Joe Kent explicitly disavowed Fuentes and Groypers and quote unquote racist for no reason at all. I think it was it was last month. It was right after AFPAC, and he had some candidate who's not even barely polling, not even doing, it's not even the incumbent he's running against, had a hit, ran a attack that no one paid attention to, and Joe Kent had a meltdown. And I think there's a way, when Trump would disavow people from on the 2016 campaign trail, he would just do, I disavow, and that would be it. And he'd just say that, and he wouldn't focus on it, and he'd move on. And there's so much of importance to Trump's presidential campaign that it didn't really matter. And it was whatever, these people are sometimes going to disavow. But having a whole day-long Twitter meltdown about somebody, that's a little bit different. And you really just... people like us really just can't support him anymore due to that, massive misfire. So I don't really recommend, even though it's still a win of sorts if he did defeat the incumbent, because it does show that these treacherous people who betrayed Trump and have terrible positions on immigration and everything we care about lose in the general election. But it's still at the same time not good, because this is a guy who went out of his way when he didn't need to explicitly disavow people like us. So that's a little bit different situation. With JD, JD is different. JD didn't explicitly disavow, and also JD, some risk himself, did come out and oppose Nick Fuentes' ban. He didn't necessarily say it in the way he should have, because he was like, Nick Fuentes is really annoying, and he says some obnoxious things. So he said this, and it's you don't need to say that. It's all you just need to say is I don't necessarily disagree with Nick or agree with Nick Fuentes, but I think he has a right to be on Twitter. And that's all you really need to say in these situations. But he still said that, and he was attacked for standing with a quote-unquote white supremacist with that. And I haven't heard him say anything much about disavowing racists and stuff. And he had a really good ad about, are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans? And then he reframed this into being, no, they just use this if you oppose immigration. So he's also running for a little bit bigger position. I mean, Senate. with JD, there are still issues with JD. I think he attacked Trump for being a racist in 2016. And it really was over the top with it. And there's still a reason to be skeptical, but he is running on all the issues that we would want a candidate to run on. He's running on non-interventionism, which is now a risky move compared to other candidates. He's also running on immigration restriction, explicitly reducing legal immigration. If you look at all his policies, it's hard to disagree with some of the stuff. I think the main mistake that he was being into is he leaned too much into this populist Inc. stuff on economics, which got Club for Growth to oppose him and some other groups. And in some ways, I just don't think that that's that important, that he should have just laid off that stuff. And he probably would be a clear front runner right now after Trump endorsing him, which now he's, it's still in doubt whether he can win. I think if he had maybe managed to eschew a lot of the populist talking points and just focused on the identity politics stuff that we mainly care about, and also just moved on from the Trump stuff. The Trump stuff was the attacks were always going to dog him, but I think otherwise everything else where he's running on is pretty good. And so I would say it's good to support JD. I mean these people are, very few candidates are going to openly support or avow people like us. And if that was our standard, I think we would have very few candidates to support. And, it's a way of marginalizing us. I think in some ways it's you just don't want them to go Joe Kent. You just don't want them to go Joe Kent where they have a day-long meltdown. And otherwise it's look, you just don't, you ignore, or you just say this is not a big deal. And if people like us get banned from Twitter or getting censored, we want people who are willing to at least say that I oppose that. Hopefully they say it in a little bit better language without just saying I hate these people, they suck, but they still should be banned. Just say I don't necessarily agree with this person. That's all you got to do. So that's my stance on that. I think with most other candidates, that are not specifically saying our stuff, as long as they're campaigning on our issues and are not going Joe Kent on us, I think you should support them. And that's my stance on that. I think everyone, it's a very pragmatic stance. And there's a bunch of candidates who are out there who are running on issues similar to us. The problem with Joe Kent is running on a pretty good platform, one of the better platforms, but you can't do stupid decisions like that. And so I'm not going to tell people he explicitly said, I don't want people like your support. And it's okay, well, we'll follow, we'll listen. We're not going to support you. And so if that's what he tells us, we'll sit and listen, and we'll see how well he does without the support of people like us. So that'd be my answer on that. I have some further thoughts on JD Vance. JD Vance, the big news last week is that Trump endorsed him. A lot of people are upset about that. Are people question about it because the whole, as every Senate primary is that everyone pretends or wants to present themselves as the real Trump candidate, as the candidate Trump should endorse. This is how Trump is going to be I'm just like Trump. And that's every candidate that's there. And Vance, despite his criticism, I guess Trump found that he was the best candidate to support. Maybe he liked his policies, or maybe just made a really good impression on him compared to everyone else in that race. There were some really bad candidates. Trump earlier last year, I think it was in March or February, he was wanting to endorse Jane Timken in the Ohio race. She's in a distant fourth now, but she was at one point considered a very strong candidate. She has to be one of the least uncharismatic or least charismatic candidates I've ever seen. I know I always use the term charisma for these candidates, but it's especially true for Republican women. All these Republican women come off as boring PTA presidents who only talk in a robotic tone. And you could see this from, the Iowa governor, Kim Reynolds, who she gave a talk, she gave the rebuttal to the State of the Union and was very robotic. She's like, hi, I'm Kim Reynolds, and Republican policies are about helping people. And this is how Jane Timken is. Jane Timken had a famous ad where she's threatened how she's gonna like castrate. Well, actually, and so did Joni Ernst in Iowa. Is like gonna castrate her opponents, and like these men need a strong woman to tell them what to do. In this ad, she weirdly walks out. The way she movements, it's just weird. And she's like, we all know guys who overcompensate for their inadequacies, and that fits my opponents to a T. And it's trying to be like dramatic and funny, but this is like the most robotic tone you could ever imagine. And every woman is like that. And Republicans for some reason love these like most boring women on earth to run as candidates. Like my favorite example was like Karen Handel. Like Karen Handel was I think she was briefly a Georgia congresswoman from the Atlanta suburbs. She lost her seat, I believe, in the 2018 blue wave. She's still around and stuff, but she beat John Ossoff, who's one of the Georgia senators now, in 2017 in this runoff race. That was an early, like where John Ossoff first became a star among libtards, and she beat him. And Karen Handel was like, I could see like Jane Timken back in her youth was like pretty good looking, but like Karen Handel was like so frumpy and just like unapproachable. It's like you're just literally running like the student like a lunchroom lady as your candidates. And Republicans love running these women, and there's no like intelligence there's not really any charm. The only women who have like kind of a charm and like a good speaker, I would think Marsha Blackburn's like pretty good at like speaking and stuff. She's not necessarily the brightest bulb out there, but she's better like compared to all these other women. She's like essentially Benito Mussolini, like in the terms of like her oratory and speaking ability. It's like we finally had like, she looks like William Jennings Bryan compared to the rest of the Republican women who are just like, ha, I am Susan and I am running to be your senator. And this is like every Republican female politician. So I was kind of on a tangent, but I just wanted to point it out. And they love, they're going to continue to have these women like that. They're just like so damn boring. And all these women always break down and like start doing libtard stuff, or like, you know, they're just so, they're not reliable politicians if you want them to be, if you want to support them. I'm thinking of people like, you know, Joni Ernst, who always like sometimes like breaks down and like supports lib causes. Liz Cheney, if you want to have an example of that. And it's a very different type of woman who's like for Democrats and Republicans. Like Democrats actually do get like some women who are very good at speaking and stuff and like can rile up a crowd. Like, you know, Elizabeth Warren, even though we all hate Elizabeth Warren, she is like that. You know, they can't do that. I mean, on the other end, you do have now like the genuine MAGA moms in Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are really like who try to imitate more the attitudes of downscale white women rather than they do like really frumpy middle class white women, even though both, I think, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene would definitely count as middle class. Boebert's like home life and like her husband getting arrested and some other weird stuff probably put her more on the scale with downscale whites, but they love Boebert and Greene. Boebert and Greene, not the most intelligent people out there, but they are at least interesting and exciting, or I don't know if excited would be the word to use, but at least that you could imagine putting them out in front of a crowd and the crowd would cheer and not go to sleep, which like the Timken and Kim Reynolds and the Karen Handels, like it's nap time. For if you want to cure your insomnia, just listen to them speak and you will be cured of your insomnia. So that's just something I wanted to point out. I guess like going back to the like general point besides my tangent on poor James Timken is Trump's endorsement still matters a lot. I think all these people on Populist Inc., even they acknowledged it. Like all these people who, pretty much everyone who's been supporting J.D. Vance are the Populist Inc. people who want Ron DeSantis to run and think Ron DeSantis is the real leader of the GOP and stuff. But no one's begging for Ron DeSantis' endorsement. And they want to always kind of compensate and be and cope and say, oh, well, Trump endorsing this person. This is just showing how the MAGA base no longer cares about Trump. Like, there were people claiming that, like, with Trump not endorsing Robbie Starbuck, who Robbie Starbuck has no chance of winning in Tennessee in the Tennessee congressional race, and not endorsing Dr. Oz, like, he's really gonna, show he's not gonna win the primary. It's like, no one's gonna give a shit about this stuff. That they do give a shit about is who he endorses for that particular race, and that's gonna make people more likely to support a candidate. And there's no other Republican who has this sway. Not Ron DeSantis, not Greg Abbott, not Ted Cruz, nobody. It is just Trump with that type of sway. And he is still the leader of the party. He's still the kingmaker. And that is putting him in a more solid position for 2024. And if most of the people he endorses win, that's a major factor. If you really want to know the power of his endorsement, is like, look at the people who lose his endorsement. Mo Brooks in Alabama, he's a great candidate. I really like Mo Brooks, but he was not running a particularly good campaign. I still think Trump should have kept his endorsement of him. But Mo Brooks, he lost his endorsement and he went down by 20 points in polls. He was like at 30, low 30s, and now he's at like 12%. And that is the power of an endorsement. If, like, when Trump rescinded it, his whole support fell out from under him. And most candidates, it would be the same in all these other candidates. And now J.D. Vance, who is struggling in third place, is now, a competitor again, and due to Trump's endorsement. And there's no other politician with that power. So I don't know how anyone's going to try to compete against Trump in 2024. I talked about, I was going to say we're going to talk more about some of these candidates who are wanting to run and compete against him. I just talked about Ron DeSantis and Abbott. There's a couple other people I wanted to talk about, but I really want to get to the next topic. We'll save it up. We've got so many more episodes. This topic's not going to go away, so we'll talk more about this later. And I want to get a better picture of people who may challenge. I think Pence is going to be dumb enough to challenge Trump head on, and that's not going to be good for Pence. But we'll discuss that in a later subject. I want to move now on to the topic of crime and how people perceive the country at the moment. I was having a talk with a relative over the weekend, and we were talking about how, there's a heightened sense of anger and animosity in the country right now. And, there's a real feeling of disenchantment and anger, as I said. And he believed that, if just people turned off the news and got out in the world, that there'd be a lot less anger. And then I was like, well, I don't know about that. If people actually, I've said this before, but if you really go out into America and, touch grass, as people say, you're almost led to be more disillusioned and more upset with what's happening. I mean, just go to your nearest mall and look at the people. And you might even start seeing crime now that's happening at the mall. I mean, there was a story over the weekend in Houston at one of the premier shopping malls in this town, in the city. There's a gun battle going on where the guy pulled out an Uzi and started shooting at people. And it's like a high-end mall in Houston, and that's happening there. So you might even witness some crime and stuff. Or just not even go to your mall, but just go to your nearest city. Maybe there are a few cities that are still pretty nice. Maybe like if you went into Nashville, you would probably not be too gripped by depression or outrage at what you see. But, if you maybe go to Baltimore, go to Detroit, go to Cleveland, go to all these other places, go to D.C. I mean, even like D.C. people thought was like a really, up and coming city. And now, people go there. There's tons of homeless encampments. There's even homeless encampments in relatively nice cities. Austin still isn't that bad, but it's like a homeless, fortress. And you just go out and you're like, man, there's something wrong in this country. So I don't really think it's all the news, even though sometimes the news gets people worked up about frivolous stuff like Mr. Potato Head. Or I think even Leah Thomas. I think that's like a relatively frivolous, even though it's a part of a bigger issue, an important issue. There is more important issues. But if you went out into cities and saw what was happening around you, the obesity, the crime, the degradation, just just the general American decline you're going to see, you're going to be like, there's something fundamentally wrong in this country. And the crime levels are just going up. And there's like even the issues when you go on to immigration. Maybe that's not something you're going to see on a daily basis, but just imagine somebody telling you, we're going to have at least 3 million illegal aliens come over to our country this year. And pretty much the vast majority of them are not going to be deported, and they're going to stay here for a while unless something happens. And the federal government has an explicit policy of not deporting illegal immigrants. Now that's something real and serious. That's not a frivolous issue. So I don't necessarily think it's the news that's making everyone angry. I think it's that, life itself in America is going to make you have a dismal feeling. Not in everywhere. There's a few places anywhere. Even though some people, as I always like to say, like imagine rural areas an oasis. Rural America, you can, outside the beautiful countryside, you'll see, if you go into town, you'll see some of the same misery that maybe on a different scale, in a different way, different look, that you would see in urban America, and in, shopping malls that would have once been nice areas for families are now a lot of criminal activities happening there. And the crime wave is just continuing to go up and up and up. I mean, the murder rate is going to exceed last year's. And last year's was the highest that we've had in 25 years. So it's on track in a lot of places to be higher. So, there are serious problems in America. And it's not just the news driving this. And I want to say it's just like this crime. The crime, it's hard even to escape because you're starting to see this into suburbs coming out. You'll see news reports about carjackings happening in places that were quiet, really extremely safe areas. You could have walked around at like 2 a.m. and not had to worry about anything. And now there are like a lot of carjackings there. And it's all part of the permissive attitude that we have towards Magic America, which it's not just law enforcement, but it's also with schools, that there's just, in years past when we had zero tolerance policies and, we kept a lid on these kids, we'd make sure that if they were beating the shit out of other kids in school or doing drugs or doing something really disruptive and bad, they'd go to a juvenile facility. We'd make sure that they were not had all this free time to go out and carjack. But now, with all the worries about the school to prison pipeline, now these schools don't do anything about these kids. So now these kids just skip school, don't have to worry about any punishment, and now they go out and commit crimes. And I think that's leading to a lot of the crime wave that we're seeing throughout the country. It's just a totally permissive attitude. And if they get arrested, they can be free on bail. No bail. They can go free and they can commit crimes again. And, it's more, and if you already read these stories that are happening in the New York Post, or reading Daily Mail or all these other places that cover these crimes, like anytime you see a story about like something crazy happening in New York City, it's like this person has like a long criminal record, like severe mental illness, like drug problem, and they had been arrested like a month before, but they were let out and they were allowed to commit crimes again and again and again and again. And so there's a totally permissive attitude towards blacks in America that allows them to commit as much crime as they want, and they know they can get away with it because we've now built a society post George Floyd into believing that systemic racism is the worst thing imaginable, and that their police are committing genocide against them, and thus we're pulling back police, we're pulling back any type of authority figures, and we're letting them do whatever they want. And I think that's a large cultural trend explaining the crime wave. And the other part I want to bring up is they always talk about the threat of white nationalist terrorism. But over the last year or so, dating back to, I think it was been April of 2021, we've seen a lot of large-scale black identity extremism. There was the attack on the Capitol, where this guy actually killed someone, unlike the January 6th, where no police officer died from injuries sustained in January 6th. But this guy, there was a Nation of Islam follower who ran over police right outside the Capitol, ran them, and then the whole news media is like, oh, the white supremacists are attacking. And then it turned out to be a black guy who loves Louis Farrakhan, and they're like, oh, completely disappear the story. No one even talks about it. And even when they bring up the officer who died in it, the other officer survived but was injured. They lump him in with the people killed by January 6 people. They're like the fallen officers, and they'll always, like, Joe Biden will always list that guy alongside as somehow he was killed by January 6 protesters like 3 months after the fact. And so that's not counted as that. Then you have the Waukesha case where, a black guy ran over and killed several white people at a Christmas parade. And that guy was had a whole history of anti-white racism, had a whole history, criminal record, had been let out of jail, and all these things. And it was a complete outrage. But he intentionally murdered the people he ran over. He was not like drunk and just like swerved. He like wanted to drive over these people in a Christmas parade. And it's just stuff that happens. We don't want to politicize this case. And then Then earlier this year, there was a Black Lives Matter leader and activist who had been profiled by the media, been given a major spotlight everywhere, and he tried to assassinate a mayoral candidate in Louisville. And this guy got easily bailed out on bail, and all the media and activists are coming together. It's like, oh, he just needs mental help. He's just, he didn't know what he was doing, and he tried to do a political assassination where he barged in the guy's campaign office and tried to kill him, tried to shoot him, and he's prevented just by the quick action of some of the staffers who like shut the door and like got him out of there. And even the mayoral candidate is trying to be like, oh, it looks like he needs some mental help. They're just like, but this is a black extremism we're seeing. This guy is it was like one of the figureheads of Black Lives Matter activism in the George Floyd riots. And this guy made a huge name for himself. And, that we just ignore it. He just needs mental help. He got bailed out. Well, he's a victim of the system. And then just last week, we had Frank James, this guy who's extremely anti-white, went on, been talking about threats for years, shooting up people, been known to the FBI, gets on a subway in New York City, shoots 10 people, wounds them, thankfully, does not kill anyone. And once again, this is our fourth case of black extremism, at least that we know of. There's probably some more. There's probably way more than that. But this is like fourth case that actually got reported in national news. Probably because we thought it was somebody, a white supremacist in all these cases until the real ID came out. And, there's no concern for it. And it's all a part of this permissive attitude of just like they can get away with whatever they want. And it goes along with this Black Lives Matter activist in Louisville. His name is Quintez Brown, and, this permissive attitude of, like, he, tried to assassinate a politician, generally, let's say a conservative activist tried to do that. I know it's a cliche to say that, like, imagine if somebody was in the other shoes, and literally just imagine, like, the reaction to this. That person would have not been bailed out. That person would have not been told, oh, he just needs mental help. Or he just said, like, they should drop all criminal charges. Like, this guy wanted to kill the mayoral candidate, and it's just treated as, like, racism, is to blame here. He doesn't deserve jail time. That's so cruel. And it's like, you can't imagine just this permissive attitude that's given to magic to go around. And there's just so many crazy events that you just like happen. It's like, pretty much all the mass shootings happening now are largely done by blacks. I mean, before they were still done by blacks, but what ones that get media attention, such as the Sacramento shooting that happened, which, like, people were like, this is why we need gun control. And then they saw who the shooters were, and it was like possibly gang related. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to talk about this one anymore, even though it killed like some people and it broke out and, in a busy downtown street where people are bar hopping and stuff. Oh, well, not going to talk about it. And then there's like, just like we had the mall shooting, I guess that would catch as a mass shooting, even though maybe only one person got shot. There was like a mass shooting at an Airbnb party, I think in Pittsburgh over the weekend, which just the videos you see from it just like outrageous. They're just like all there, and then like somebody starts shooting, and then you're just like, oh no. And with the past, when these mass shootings happen, maybe there was like a higher, death toll, you could say, but because a lot of it is it's like 20 people wounded, one dead, or nobody wounded, or nobody killed, and that's a little bit different from like say like Parkland or Newtown or anything like that, and it's not taking place in a school. But most of these mass shootings, they're taking place in schools. And there was like this mass shooting, it was like happened in Texas last year, where the kid was bailed out after a day. And like his news story is like, oh, he's bullied and he had to defend himself. It's like, oh yeah, we believe this story. So there's just like this totally permissive attitude. And like, you know, in the 2010s where he didn't have much crime, they would, you know, go ballistic over any mass shooting, blame white America, talk about what, this is why we need to confiscate all guns. And now when we're seeing like every mass shooting that break out, like, oh, it's once again white terror, and then the suspect is shown, and like, yeah, we're gonna ignore this story. I mean, they didn't necessarily totally bury the Frank James story, because I mean, it happened in New York City subway. You know, people are getting antsy. It happened in, you know, anything that happens in New York City or DC or elsewhere, you know, that generally becomes national news just because the whole news media is focused there. And it did get a little bit of attention, but, you know, compared to if it had been a white guy saying racist stuff, like this would be the number one news story today. And Biden would have probably given a whole national address about it and how we need to do more. And lawmakers have been drawing up bills to counter the threat of white identity extremism. But once it's a black guy, they're like, oh, well, it's just part and parcel of living in life in America. So that's something we want to say. The final thought I want to conclude on is there is a trend on both right-wing and left-wing Twitter to blame outside forces for this rise in crime. There's less so with right-wing Twitter, but it's still there amongst certain sections of the right-wing Twitter. But with left-wing Twitter, whenever they see a mass shooting, there's now either an indifference to it, which is the majority position, which is what they did with the Frank James thing, is like, oh, well, it's part and parcel of life in America. Or there's the, it must be actually the CIA that did this. Sean McCarthy, who some of you guys might be familiar with, is like some left-wing doofus. I mean, he sometimes posts funny things, but he literally will blame everything on the CIA without, you know, any without any thought to it. And he's clearly blaming the CIA and federal agencies for this, for black crime and stuff. It's like, oh, you think that this is done by black nationalists, but it's actually was secretly done by the CIA. Like, why aren't the cameras working? It's like, oh, maybe it's because the New York City can no longer afford its infrastructure. Maybe it's because like infrastructure is breaking down because like of American decline, not because the CIA is like, ho, we're gonna set up this black radical. We're gonna wound 10 people. And we're not going to turn on the cameras for some reason, even though there's tons of eyewitnesses. There's like dozens of eyewitnesses who see people injured. There's 10 people with actual gunshot injuries. There's dozens of people who see this guy run off the train. And we're going to say, oh, it's all an optical illusion created by the CIA so they can do more evil CIA stuff. And the left loves blaming this stuff because they can't actually blame like the culprits behind this. So, and it makes it more fun to just blame everything on the CIA. A lot of people like doing this for this. I mean, it's the laziest explanation in the world just to see like any event happen and be like CIA, unless it's like happening overseas and there's like a suspicious event against one of one of our foreign enemies. Like, but when it comes to domestically, like people always assume that, and it's very lazy and doesn't actually explain what happened there. And it's very true with it. With the right, it's a little bit different. It takes a more metaphysical approach. You could have even seen this with the Astro World thing. Is that when you ever they see magic break out, they look at it and instead of concluding this is just magic, they say, you know what, it's actually demons in control here. And they did this with Astro World, the festival with like Travis Scott, and where there was a crush of people and like some people got stampeded and died. And both the right and the left, the CIA posters and the want to blame everything on demonic possession, which I understand that people would always turn to metaphysical reasons for that, especially depending on their level of belief. But I think, when there's like something staring at you in the face as the explanation for this, like the Travis Scott thing, it's like, it's like a dumb festival where they let too many people in and all these idiots like didn't respect don't respect each other, and they just like stampeded over each other. And I don't necessarily know if it was like, I don't think is necessarily demons guiding them, but some people preferred that explanation. And with the left, they were explaining it as like, oh, it was capitalism that was pushing them into this, or maybe the CIA that was behind this all. And so it's always like wanting to, when you have an explanation staring at you in the face, but it's very controversial to say that that's the explanation for it. So you then turn to something like out of this world, or makes it much more like a movie. So, if you see crime happening, it's not as interesting to say, well, this is just how the people are. Or it's much more interesting to say is like a demon was guiding them to shoot. Or it was the CIA telling them to shoot. And they love to imagine these outside forces, and it gives them like the ability to really read events and really understand the depths behind it. And they're going to be the true investigator behind this event. And a lot of people on the left and the right also, when they see facts come to their beforehand and, making the obvious point that is politically incorrect, they then decide that, oh, it's not really race or it's not really culture. It's actually class that explains this. It's like there's a class war that's happening with crime. And sometimes the right goes really into this like, oh, there's a war against elites against normal people. And it's like, I don't think the people mugging and carjacking are elites. I think they're a different group of people. I think it's once again magic happening. So I think with both sides, they don't want to blame magic. They don't want to really blame minorities, because for some it's more on the left than the right, but they don't want to pretend that these people have agency, and that either evil forces of capitalism or the CIA are guiding them. And with some of the people on the right, it's a class war, the elites, or maybe even demons guiding them. When it is like, there's obvious facts staring at you in the face when this is happening, and people just don't want to say it, And this is what's causing, our crime wave is being caused directly by blacks. And that's factual. But why is it now happening more than before? I think it's due to this permissive attitude, cultural attitude by the authorities towards magic behavior that 10, 15 years ago, there was not that permissive attitude. And so we're now in this state that there is. And I guess in the way to conclude this is going back to the point is like, simply turning off your TV and touching grass is not going to make you think that the world is great. There are ways that you can be happy and you can enjoy your life and stuff. You can have a great family, you can have great friends, the immediate circle, everything can be good. But outside that immediate circle, there are major problems that you can't run away from. And, isolating yourself from the news or mentions of things that you don't like, and just pretending that it's all hunky-dory in your immediate circle, eventually the decline is going to reach you. You can't escape the decline. And I always want to say the only escape is victory. You can maintain a degree of sanity in your own circumstances and among the people you associate with, but that's not the whole world. There's a whole other world outside of that circle, and it's got a lot of problems. So that's the concluding point I want to make. I'm going to have a great IQ supplement later this week. Going to have another terrific episode next week. So make sure you sign up for the IQ supplements if you haven't already. People really love them. I've gotten reviews. People say that they're even better than the normal episodes. And I know that's hard to imagine, but it's true. That's what the people are saying. So make sure you sign up for those. And that's it for today. So until next time, stay respected.